So far it's been interesting partly because we, I think, have spoken so little about energy, because this kind of a conference in Azerbaijan not that long ago would have been very energy heavy, let us say. And so it's a sign of the diversification of the economy here, and it's a sign of the increasing global role in a number of different areas, I think, for Azerbaijan, that we are not, speaking about energy the entire day. That said, it is my bread and butter when it comes to this region, and so I will speak about that. And I think that now, here in September of 2013, it is worth stopping briefly to acknowledge what, frankly, was an incredible achievement back in June of the finally the selection by the Shah-Deniz Consortium, led by SOCAR, on what was going to be the Southern Corridor energy route. And choosing TAP, the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline, a historic achievement and a very, I think, savvy choice. Because while, we all know the operatic, ups and downs of Nabucco, I think finally the choice that was made was the commercial one. It was the one that is going to, in the long run, be very good in terms of bringing diversity of routes and sources of natural gas to Europe. And it is the one that is going to be the key building block for the future of the Southern Energy Corridor, which is by no means finished. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what I think the next steps of the Southern Energy Corridor, what, in my opinion, they ought to be. But as I said, I think it's worth stopping and acknowledging this immense achievement, because it genuinely is one. And it's not just because for over a decade in Europe, in the United States, in the greater Black Sea Caspian region, there was discussion, but there was stasis when it comes to genuine progress on the Southern Energy Corridor post the BTC pipeline, the second phase of the Southern Corridor. There was stasis, and that was because essentially we had this logjam of Nabucco with no financing. Everyone knows the story. So that is an incredible breakthrough. It's also very important, I think, this decision, because it brings SOCAR as a company onto the world stage. It makes it suddenly, from being just the national energy company of Azerbaijan to being a major regional player in very tangible ways, together with a number of other key investments that it has made throughout the region and within the European Union. But it sort of flies SOCAR's flag internationally much higher than it ever has before, and that is something that must be taken into account, not just here in the region, but certainly in Europe and the United States, and even in the Far East, because it doesn't take very long, as we've seen in a number of other similar instances, for a dynamic, initially smaller national oil company to emerge as a key player. And we were talking about the similarities between Norway's state oil fund and SOFAS earlier. Well, a fantastic example for what SOCAR could achieve and seems to be achieving at the moment on that track is actually Norway's state oil company, Statoil, which was very much like SOCAR actually not that long ago, and now is a global player competing directly with the super majors. So, I'm not to get ahead of ourselves, but I mean, this is something that those of us in the energy industry, those of us who are sort of oil and gas watchers, very much need to take into account. And it's because this is not just a story about TAP, the Trans-Adriatic Pipeline. As we've heard, I would argue it's actually even more about the larger pipeline, TANAP, the Trans-Anatolian Pipeline, going through Turkey. And this is incredibly significant. We talk about SOCAR's various sort of international projects at the moment, retail in, I think, being one of the, if not the dominant retail actor in Georgia, taking over Exxon's retail in Switzerland, investing in refineries in Turkey and elsewhere, investing, of course, in Greece, the major deal with DESFA, interests in Israel offshore. You know, these are major steps, but the biggest step is, of course, the fact that within what is a traditionally, let us say, difficult energy market to work in Turkey, SOCAR will be the lead on the TANAP project, will be the operator of that project. That is a key achievement. And in the context, I mean, I can't stress this enough. It's perhaps a little bit inside baseball, but you know, I cannot stress for the, you know, compared to the last 10 years of discussion about the Southern Corridor topics, you know, this is a major change. It's a major achievement. So now that I have said that, and I should also acknowledge very briefly, but importantly, that we are not at the final stage, of course, of this phase 2 of the Southern Energy Corridor. There are still final investment decisions to be made, and there are still some key decisions to be made about you know, how consortia will look like, how the various new players will work together. But I think we can check a very important box. So looking into the future, what are the next steps after phase 2 of the Southern Energy Corridor? Well, I think before we talk about the specific steps, which are already many of them planned and some that I'm going to propose, I think we need to take our experience and some lessons learned from the past decade. We must not repeat the mistakes of the last decade. And this is advice less so to SOCAR in Azerbaijan, but more so to its partners in Europe and partly in the United States. But I have to, frankly, put my criticism fairly squarely on European Commission involvement and European private sector actors in, frankly, not pulling their weight in the last decade when it came to coordinating with Azerbaijan, when it came to crippling delays before we finally got to the June decision, when it comes to lack of financing, that was a huge problem. The very wrong kinds of messages being sent to the producer country, those that hold the resource, those that hold the gas in the Caspian. Courting of Gazprom throughout Europe in the midst of this process. And, of course, inaction, just genuine inaction, lack of involvement by EU and member state, European member state high-level officials in this extremely important strategic process, and a reliance on Washington, on the United States, to pull their weight instead. And that's not going to be, given a number of global realities that I need not get into, that's not going to be possible going forward. The European private sector and the European Commission and member state governments are going to have to pull their weight when it comes to the next phases of the Southern Corridor. And they're going to have to work far more closely with Azerbaijan and with SOCAR to make sure that this gets done. Because, frankly, the only reason that this June decision was achieved was because of leadership from SOCAR and from Azerbaijan and the Shah Deniz consortium stepping up to the plate to make the pipelines happen that they needed, because they found that they couldn't rely on anyone else. So that's just a little sort of criticism for what we should avoid going forward. But I think there are, you know, now looking at a, you know, envision a pipeline map. Many of you in this room, I think, can do that because we look at them so often in this region. There are 5 future vectors that I would like to briefly go over of what the next steps of the Southern Energy Corridor could be. 2 of those have already been presented by BP with the approval of the Shah Deniz consortium, and therefore, you know, those are kind of ones that are, there's already been a BP sponsored map produced with the 2 next steps of the Southern Corridor. You can look it up on their website, or I believe also potentially Shah Deniz has that too. Those are, of course, as one might expect, the rump of the old Nabucco route, Nabucco West, or, you know, what was also SEEP at one point. You know, something along those lines will eventually go forward as a next step, whether that is the step after this one or whether it is sort of two steps along the road remains to be seen. There is need at Baumgarten in Austria for natural gas. Demand will remain high in the European Union, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, in these very strategically important markets. And so that route, there will be a need for that route. But whether it comes before or after this other route, which is basically what we used to call the Western Balkans sort of gas ring or interconnector, that is also on the map by BP and the consortium, the Shah-Deniz consortium, to go along the coast of the Western Balkans and include a number of key countries coming off of TAP, obviously, which, of course, as you know, goes through Albania, and then distributing both to the Western Balkans, which are in great need of natural gas, but also further up, potentially, to Central Europe as well. And now I step out of what has been sort of officially presented and what my sort of recommendations are for what the next three steps of the Southern Corridor ought to be. And again, this is not to necessarily get ahead of ourselves, but this is because, as we have seen in the past decade of travails in trying to get to where we finally got this year, you know, forward planning is very important. And coordination is very important. And so, you know, as much as we can do that ahead of time, as much as, you know, European actors can be sort of brought together to work as one together with Azerbaijan, the better. And so this kind of forward planning is important. And it's also important for key diplomatic support that obviously comes from the United States and other actors. So I would say that this is something that the Italians often speak about, which is that TAP, as it is planned now, could, whether you need to build a dedicated pipeline through south-north in Italy or not, it would be possible to bring volumes further north, out of Italy, to the north and west, potentially to the lucrative Rhine Valley area. That's something that sort of Italian companies are keen about, and something that I think should be discussed here in Baku and not to be discussed in other European capitals as an interesting and realistic option down the road. The fourth one, I think, is the one that is very important and extremely key here in Baku, here for Azerbaijan. And this has been said, everyone knows this has been said now for more than a decade, for almost 2 decades. But it must be reiterated because it is incredibly strategically important. It is about Azerbaijan as a gateway to the greater Caspian and greater Central Asian region. And that is, of course, the connection, the trans-Caspian connection across to Turkmenistan. This is vitally important for Azerbaijan strategically, for the region, and clearly for European consumers. I have spent some of the past year, quite a lot, in Ashgabat, speaking with Turkmen policymakers and energy officials there, and there is openness to this. There sometimes, you know, it's not, let's say, always easygoing in negotiations on energy with Ashgabat, but there is openness to this. I can assure you of that, especially now that the eastern part of Turkmenistan has become a CNPC stronghold. Ashgabat is looking to diversify away from China. It is, as many of you know, actively trying to do that through Afghanistan with the TAPI pipeline, but I would say more realistic and more strategically important is the Trans-Caspian option. And the key thing about this, which we must all remember, is just how easy it would be to build. Yeah? It would be incredibly easy to build. It's just a matter of connecting existing infrastructure in the Caspian. And finally, the fifth sort of recommendation that I would make about future steps for the Southern Corridor is perhaps a more controversial one, but I think one that can be seriously considered by SOCAR. For a long time, of course, when we were discussing the Nabucco Classic, the full Nabucco, there was the idea of a spur to northern Iraq, to the Kurdish regions of northern Iraq, to bring natural gas from there. I think that's still potentially a good idea. However, I would recommend a TANAP spur going south that would be significantly different, which would involve potentially SOCAR in what is going to be the major offshore natural gas production in the Eastern Mediterranean. As I said, SOCAR is already involved in Israel on this issue, Cyprus, Turkey, and Greece. These are going to be future natural gas producing areas of significant volume, and SOCAR, I believe, is in a very good position to take advantage of that and to link it into what is now becoming a regional network and not just a corridor. So that's my sort of humble advice looking far into the future, but hopefully those sorts of steps, particularly the first two, which have already been approved, can be achieved more quickly than the last one. And with Azerbaijani leadership, I think we have found that that is possible. I think that, it is important for actors, based in the United States, NATO, the European Union, European governments. It is important for the broader transatlantic community, I think, to understand now with this decision the pivotal strategic importance of Azerbaijan for European and transatlantic energy security. And I think it's also time for, instead of just talking about Caspian gas as an alternative to Russian gas, it's time that we look to the gas from this region as being primary partners, as the producers in this region being primary partners for the broader transatlantic community. Because that is the reality of the region, that's the reality of the infrastructure going forward, and the transatlantic community is going to miss the boat if they don't see it that way.